Sometimes the folks who laugh at you the loudest are the ones who regret it most. Jake Holler knew that feeling well, standing in that dusty saloon while everyone mocked him for inheriting a worthless ranch. The old Granger place was nothing but 20 acres of scrub and broken dreams. Jake took it anyway. It was all his uncle left him. He worked the land alone, mending fences and planting vegetables by the old barn. One morning while digging a root cellar, his spade hit something strange. Black rock with bright yellow veins running through it. The same folks who laughed called him a fool when he brought samples to town. But when the geologist confirmed what Jake had found, everything changed. Word spread fast. Gold, pure and deep, worth over $120 million. But how would Jake handle his newfound wealth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning, smudged with dust and bearing the unmistakable scent of leather and tobacco that always clung to Uncle Bill's belongings. Jake Holler turned the envelope over in his calloused hands, noting the careful script that spelled out his name in fading ink. Inside, folded between two pieces of yellowed paper, lay the deed to the Granger ranch and a brief note that would change everything. "Jake," it read, "this place chose you before you chose it. Don't let them tell you what it's worth." That was 3 months ago. Now, as Jake stood in the middle of what most folks called the most cursed piece of land in Millbrook County, he wondered if Uncle Bill had been touched by the desert sun when he'd written those words. The ranch stretched before him like a testament to neglect 20 acres of scrub brush, tumbleweeds, and broken promises. The fence posts leaned at angles that defied logic, their barbed wire hanging in rusty loops that caught the morning light like spiderwebs after rain. Uncle Bill's old hat still hung on a nail beside the front door of the cabin, its brim worn smooth by decades of hard weather and harder work. Jake had left it there when he'd first arrived, thinking it somehow kept watch over the place. Now, 3 months into his inheritance, he understood why his uncle had never taken it down. Some things were meant to stay put, to bear witness to the passage of time and the stubbornness of men who refused to quit. Jake had spent most of his 38 years working other people's cattle on other people's land, moving from ranch to ranch across 3 states like tumbleweeds himself. He'd learned to read the sky for weather, to know a horse's mood by the set of its ears, and to mend what was broken with whatever materials came to hand. What he'd never learned was how to own something, how to plant roots in soil that belonged to him. The cabin was small but solid, built from pine logs that had weathered to the color of old silver. Uncle Bill had chinked the gaps with mud and moss, and the roof, though missing a few shingles, kept out most of the rain. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its chimney rising straight and true toward the endless sky. Jake had spent his first night here listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the scent of sage and the distant sound of coyotes calling to each other across the darkness. The barn was another story entirely. Its roof sagged like the back of an old horse, and the doors hung askew on rusted hinges. Jake had spent 2 weeks just making it safe enough to store his few belongings: a bedroll, a coffee maker, and a battered suitcase that held everything he owned. The barn would need new boards, new nails, and more work than one man could reasonably accomplish in a lifetime. But it was his barn now, his responsibility, and that knowledge settled in his chest like a warm meal after a long day's work. The town of Millbrook lay 5 miles to the east, connected to the ranch by a dirt road that washboarded in the dry season and turned to sucking mud when the rains came. Jake had driven it enough times now to know every pothole and curve, every place where the road narrowed between stands of juniper and scrub oak. The town itself was nothing special: a main street, lined with false-fronted buildings that had seen better days, a few side streets that petered out into residential areas where the houses sat on large lots behind chain-link fences. The Silver Dollar Saloon sat at the heart of Main Street, its swinging doors opening onto an interior that hadn't changed much since the 1000 960s. Jake had made the mistake of stopping there his first week in town, thinking he might find work or at least a friendly face. Instead, he'd found Hank Morrison and his crew holding court at the bar, their laughter echoing off the tin ceiling as they shared stories about the various fools who'd tried to make something of the Granger place over the years. "That land's cursed," Hank had declared, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd lived in Millbrook all his life. 3 different families tried to ranch it in the last 20 years. Every one of them went broke. Ground's too poor, water's too scarce, and the spirits of the old-timers who died out there don't take kindly to strangers. Jake had nursed his beer in silence, listening to the catalogue of failures that seemed to define his inheritance. The Petersons had tried cattle and lost half their herd to a late spring blizzard. The Johnsons had attempted to grow hay and watched their irrigation system fail 3 seasons running. The Williamses had lasted longest, nearly 7 years, before a house fire claimed everything they'd built and sent them packing to relatives in Colorado. "Course, now we got young Jake here thinking he can make a go of it," Hank had continued, his gaze settling on Jake like a bird of prey sizing up a wounded rabbit. "No offense, son, but you got about as much chance of success out there as a snowball in hell. That place'll chew you up and spit you out same as it did the others." The laughter that followed had been good-natured enough, but Jake had felt the weight of their skepticism like a physical thing. He'd finished his beer, left money on the bar, and walked out into the desert evening, with their voices still ringing in his ears. He'd driven back to the ranch in silence, Uncle Bill's hat catching his eye in the rearview mirror where he'd hung it from the gun rack. Sarah Martinez had been different. Jake had met her at the post office 2 weeks later, where she was picking up a package of books for the elementary school where she taught. She was perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes that seemed to take the measure of things without judgment. When Jake had introduced himself, she'd smiled and said she was glad someone was finally going to give the old place a chance. "Your uncle was a good man," she'd told him, cradling the package of books against her chest. "He used to come to town every few months, always had a kind word for the children. He talked about you sometimes, said you had good hands and a steady heart." Jake had felt something ease in his chest at those words, a tightness he hadn't even realized was there. Here was someone who remembered Uncle Bill with fondness, who didn't see the ranch as a curse, but as a place that simply needed the right person to bring it back to life. The days had settled into a rhythm after that. Jake rose with the sun, made coffee over the fire, and spent his mornings walking the property lines, learning the lay of the land. The afternoons were for work mending fence, clearing brush, patching holes in the barn roof. He'd found an old vegetable garden behind the cabin, its borders marked by stones that Uncle Bill had hauled in from the creek bed. Jake had cleared the weeds and turned the soil, planting tomatoes, beans, and squash from seed packets he'd bought at the hardware store. The evenings were the hardest part. When the sun dropped behind the western hills and the temperature began to fall, Jake would sit on the front porch and listen to the silence. It was a different kind of quiet than he'd ever experienced, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper. The wind moving through the sagebrush, the distant call of a hawk, the rustle of small creatures going about their business in the gathering darkness. Sometimes he would take Uncle Bill's hat down from its nail and turn it over in his hands, feeling the smooth leather of the band and the places where sweat had stained the crown. The hat held memories he couldn't quite grasp, glimpses of the man who'd worn it, the seasons he'd weathered, the hopes and disappointments that had shaped his days. Jake would put it back on its nail before going inside, leaving it to stand watch over the land that had claimed them both. The water situation had been his first real crisis. The well was old and shallow, prone to running dry in the heat of summer. Jake had learned to ration every drop, to collect rainwater in buckets and barrels, to make do with less than he'd ever thought possible. The pump was temperamental, requiring a particular combination of coaxing and cursing to produce even a trickle. Jake had spent hours studying its workings, learning to read the signs that predicted its moods. The isolation had been harder to manage than the physical challenges. Jake was used to working alone, but he'd never been truly alone before. There had always been a bunkhouse full of other hands, a cook who would have coffee ready before dawn, a foreman who would tell him what needed doing each day. Here, every decision was his to make, every problem his to solve. The weight of that responsibility was both frightening and oddly liberating. He'd started keeping a journal, writing down his observations about the land, the weather, the slow progress of his various projects. The entries were brief and practical at first: notes about which fence posts needed replacing, when to plant the winter vegetables, how much hay he'd need to buy if he decided to keep a horse. But gradually, they'd become more personal, a record of his thoughts and feelings as he learned to call this place home. The town remained skeptical. Jake could see it in the way people looked at him when he came in for supplies. In the polite but distant way, they answered his questions about local weather patterns and soil conditions. He was the latest in a long line of dreamers who'd thought they could make something of the Granger place, and the smart money was on him, joining the list of failures before the first snow fell. But Jake had Uncle Bill's hat watching over him, and Uncle Bill's words echoing in his memory. "This place chose you before you chose it." He didn't understand what that meant yet, but he was beginning to suspect he would. The land had a way of revealing its secrets to those who were patient enough to listen, persistent enough to stay. Jake had both qualities in abundance, forged by years of hard work and disappointment into something resembling wisdom. As summer gave way to autumn, Jake found himself thinking less about the town's expectations and more about the small victories that marked his days. The tomatoes were coming in well, their red globes heavy on the vine. The fence he'd mended was holding strong against the wind. The barn roof no longer leaked when it rained. These were modest achievements, but they belonged to him in a way that nothing else ever had. He'd started planning for winter, calculating how much firewood he'd need, how to better insulate the cabin, whether the old truck would make it through the mountain passes when the snow came. The thought of being snowed in for weeks at a time didn't frighten him the way it once had. He was beginning to understand that solitude and loneliness were different things, that a man could be alone without being lonely if he found the right relationship with the land that sustained him. The journal entries grew longer as the days grew shorter. Jake wrote about the way the light slanted across the valley in the morning, the sound of geese passing overhead on their way south, the first frost that turned the sagebrush silver. He wrote about Uncle Bill, trying to piece together the man from the evidence he'd left behind, the careful way he'd laid out the garden, the books he'd kept on a shelf beside the fireplace, the repair jobs that spoke of infinite patience and limited resources. Most of all, Jake wrote about the feeling that was growing stronger each day, the sense that he was exactly where he belonged. The ranch might be cursed in the minds of the townspeople, but for Jake, it was becoming something else entirely. It was home, in a way that no place had ever been before. It was his to tend, his to improve, his to love, despite its flaws and challenges. The first snow came early that year, dusting the peaks of the surrounding mountains, while the valley remained green and gold. Jake stood on his porch in the early morning light, Uncle Bill's hat in his hands, and watched the distant peaks turn pink in the rising sun. Winter was coming, and with it the real test of his commitment to this place. But he was ready for it now, as ready as a man could be for the challenges that lay ahead. He put the hat back on its nail and went inside to make coffee, already planning the day's work. There was firewood to split, a leak in the barn roof to patch, and always the endless task of learning to read the moods and needs of the land that had chosen him. It was good work, honest work, and it was his. The idea came to Jake on a crisp October morning when the first frost had turned the grass silver and his breath formed small clouds in the cold air. He'd been thinking about winter storage, about the vegetables he'd managed to coax from the reluctant soil, and how to preserve them through the long months ahead. The cabin had a small pantry, but it wasn't nearly large enough for the harvest he'd managed to gather. Uncle Bill had mentioned a root cellar in one of his letters, but Jake had never found it. He'd searched the obvious places near the cabin, behind the barn, along the creek bed where the ground stayed cooler. Nothing. But as he stood in the garden that morning, watching the steam rise from his coffee cup, he realized he'd been thinking like a modern man, instead of like someone who'd lived through the lean years of the 1930s and 1940s. A root cellar wouldn't be convenient. It would be practical, hidden, safe from both the elements and from neighbors who might be tempted to help themselves during hard times. Jake walked slowly around the cabin, looking at the land with new eyes, trying to think like Uncle Bill. The spot revealed itself to him like a secret whispered in his ear. Behind the cabin, perhaps 50 yards toward the creek, lay a natural depression in the ground. It was masked by a stand of scrub oak that had grown up over the years, their roots holding the soil in place and their branches creating a natural screen. Jake had walked past it dozens of times without really seeing it, but now he noticed the way the ground dipped slightly, the way the vegetation grew differently there. He spent the morning clearing away the brush, working methodically with an old axe he'd found in the barn. The oak trees came down reluctantly, their roots run deep and twisted through decades of growth. But as Jake worked, he began to see signs that someone had worked this ground before, stones that had been placed rather than scattered by nature, a slight regularity to the depression that spoke of human hands. By noon, he'd cleared enough brush to see the full extent of the area. It was perhaps 10 feet square, the ground soft and dark, where years of fallen leaves had composted into rich soil. Jake fetched his shovel from the barn and began to dig, starting at what seemed to be the center of the depression. The first foot went easily, the soil turning over in neat clods that smelled of earth and moisture. Jake had dug his share of holes over the year's fence, post holes, irrigation ditches, graves for horses that had served their time. He knew the feel of different soils, the way clay resisted the shovel while sand offered no purchase. This soil was different, loamy and rich, as if someone had been feeding it for years. At 2 feet down, his shovel hit something solid. Not rock. Jake knew the sound of metal on stone. This was different, a dull thunk that spoke of wood. He cleared the dirt away carefully, using his hands now instead of the shovel. What emerged was a board, old and weathered, but still solid. Pine, by the look of it, cut thick and fitted tight. Jake's heart began to beat faster. He'd found Uncle Bill's root cellar, or what was left of it. He dug more carefully now, following the edge of the board until he'd outlined what appeared to be a wooden cover perhaps 4 feet square. There was no handle, no obvious way to lift it, but Jake could see where the boards had been fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that belonged to an earlier era. He worked his shovel under one edge of the cover, using it as a lever to pry up the boards. They came reluctantly, warped by years of moisture and pressure, but they came. As the cover lifted, Jake caught a glimpse of darkness beneath, and the smell that rose from the opening was different from the rich earth around it, easier, cooler, touched with something mineral and strange. Jake cleared away more dirt, creating a proper opening. The root cellar was deeper than he'd expected, perhaps 6 feet down, with walls that appeared to be lined with stone. Uncle Bill had built this thing to last, to keep vegetables fresh through the long winters, when fresh food meant the difference between thriving and merely surviving. Jake fetched a flashlight from the cabin and returned to peer down into the cellar. The beam revealed stone walls fitted together without mortar, the kind of work that took time and patience and a deep understanding of how stones wanted to lie. The floor appeared to be hard-packed earth, and there were wooden shelves built into the walls, their boards grey with age but still sturdy. But it was what lay scattered on the floor that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Rocks, dozens of them, some as small as a child's fist, others the size of dinner plates. They caught the flashlight beam and threw it back in ways that ordinary rocks didn't. These stones were black, dark as midnight, but shot through with veins of something that gleamed yellow in the light. Jake climbed down into the cellar, his feet finding purchase on stones that had been fitted into the walls like a crude ladder. The ceiling was low enough that he had to duck, but the space was larger than it had appeared from above. Uncle Bill had hollowed out a proper room down here, complete with wooden supports to keep the ceiling from caving in. Jake picked up one of the rocks, turning it over in his hands. It was heavier than it looked, dense and solid, and those yellow veins ran through it like lightning frozen in stone. He'd seen enough geology books to recognize quartz when he saw it, but this was different. This yellow substance was softer than quartz, more malleable, and it caught the light in a way that made his stomach flutter with possibility. He gathered several of the rocks, choosing ones with the most prominent yellow veining, and climbed back out of the cellar. In the full light of day, they looked even more promising. The black rock was some kind of granite or basalt, common enough in this part of the country. But those yellow veins, they had a richness to them, a depth of color that spoke of something more valuable than mere quartz. Jake sat on the ground beside the open cellar, turning the rocks over in his hands, his mind racing with possibilities he barely dared to consider. Uncle Bill had collected these rocks for a reason. He'd hidden them in a root cellar that most people would never find, had kept them secret for reasons that were becoming clearer by the moment. Gold, Jake whispered to himself, the word hanging in the air like a prayer or a curse. He'd heard stories, of course. Everyone in this part of the country had heard stories about gold strikes, about prospectors who'd found fortunes in the most unlikely places. But those were stories from the past, from the days when men walked into the mountains with nothing but a pick and a pan and the hope that they'd strike it rich. This was the 21st century. Gold mines were corporate operations, massive excavations that required millions of dollars in equipment and environmental studies that took years to complete. But the rocks in his hands told a different story. They whispered of possibilities that Jake had never allowed himself to imagine: financial security, independence, the ability to improve the ranch, to make it everything Uncle Bill had dreamed it could be. Jake spent the rest of the day examining every inch of the cellar, collecting more samples, trying to understand what Uncle Bill had known and when he'd known it. The rocks weren't randomly scattered, they'd been sorted, organized by size and by the prominence of the yellow veining. Uncle Bill had been studying them, learning from them, preparing for something he'd never lived to see. As the sun began to set, Jake carefully replaced the wooden cover over the cellar and scattered loose dirt across it. Whatever he'd found down there, whatever it meant, he needed time to think before he acted. The rocks he'd collected went into a canvas bag that he carried back to the cabin, where he spread them out on the kitchen table under the light of a kerosene lamp. Each rock told the same story. Black stone shot through with veins of yellow metal that caught the light and held it. Some pieces had more metal than others, but every single one showed signs of the same mineral deposit. Uncle Bill hadn't just found a few scattered pieces of ore. He'd found what appeared to be a significant deposit, maybe even a vein that ran through the property. Jake made coffee and sat at the table, staring at the rocks as darkness fell outside. Uncle Bill's hat hung on its nail by the door, and Jake found himself looking at it, wondering what secrets the old man had taken to his grave. Had he known what these rocks were worth? Had he been afraid to find out, afraid of what the knowledge might bring? The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and sending tumbleweeds dancing across the yard. Jake gathered the rocks back into their bag and stowed them under his bed, but sleep was impossible. His mind raced with questions and possibilities, with dreams and fears in equal measure. By morning, Jake had made his decision. He would take the rocks to town, find someone who could tell him definitively what he'd found. If it was nothing, if he was chasing fool's gold and wishful thinking, at least he'd know. But if it was something more, if Uncle Bill had left him a legacy beyond 20 acres of scrub brush and broken fences, then Jake needed to understand what that meant. The strange black rocks lay heavy in their canvas bag beside his bed, holding secrets that would change everything. Jake Holler had found something in that root cellar, something that his uncle had hidden away for reasons only the dead man knew. Whether it was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: his life would never be the same. Jake spent 3 restless days turning the rocks over in his hands, studying them under different lights, trying to convince himself he wasn't chasing shadows. The yellow veins seemed to glow in the morning sun streaming through the cabin windows, but in the lamplight they looked ordinary, almost dull. His rational mind told him he was probably looking at fool's gold pyrite that had fooled countless prospectors over the decades. But something deeper, some instinct he couldn't quite name, whispered that these rocks held more promise than disappointment. On the fourth morning, while organizing Uncle Bill's few belongings for what felt like the 100th time, Jake made a discovery that changed everything. He'd been going through the old man's books, running his fingers along the worn spines of volumes on ranching, weather patterns, and desert survival. Most were practical texts, the kind of books a man collected when knowledge meant the difference between success and failure. But wedged between a guide to native plants and a farmer's almanac from 1987, Jake found something unexpected. A journal, thin and leather-bound, its cover worn smooth by countless handlings. Jake opened it carefully, the spine crackling with age, and found himself looking at Uncle Bill's careful handwriting. The entries were sporadic, sometimes months apart, but they painted a picture of a man who'd been keeping secrets for longer than Jake had imagined. March 15, 1994, read the first entry. Found another piece today, bigger than the last. The vein runs deeper than I thought. Should probably tell someone, but who? The government would take it all, call it mineral rights or some such nonsense. Better to wait, see how far it goes. Jake's hands trembled as he turned the pages. Entry after entry detailed Uncle Bill's discoveries, his growing understanding of what lay beneath the seemingly worthless acres of scrub and stone. The old man had been systematically exploring the property for decades, following the mineral vein wherever it led, always careful to cover his tracks and keep his findings secret. June 3, 1998, another entry read. The assay came back from Denver, 98% pure. Nearly choked on my coffee when I read that. This isn't some weekend prospector's dream, this is the real thing. But what do I do with it? I'm 73 years old. Too old to fight the lawyers and government men who'd come swarming like locusts if word got out. Jake found himself sinking into Uncle Bill's old chair, the journal heavy in his hands. His uncle had known. For years, maybe decades, he'd known exactly what treasures lay hidden beneath the ranch. But he'd also understood something that Jake was only beginning to grasp, that sometimes knowledge was more dangerous than ignorance. The entries revealed a pattern of careful exploration and cautious optimism. Uncle Bill had taken samples to different assayers, always driving hundreds of miles to ensure anonymity. He'd researched mineral rights, mining claims, environmental regulations. He'd even consulted with lawyers, though always hypothetically, never revealing the true nature of his interest. What emerged from the pages was the portrait of a man torn between excitement and fear. The gold was real, that much was certain. The deposits were substantial, potentially worth millions. But Uncle Bill had also understood the costs that would come with such wealth. The attention from corporations and government agencies, the transformation of his quiet ranch into an industrial site. The destruction of the land he'd spent his life protecting. September 12, 2003, read one particularly poignant entry. Watch them tear up the Morrison place today. Mining company promised them millions, and maybe they'll get it, eventually. But the land is ruined forever. Streams poisoned, topsoil gone, nothing left but holes in the ground. Is that what I want for this place? Is that the legacy I want to leave? Jake understood now why Uncle Bill had never acted on his knowledge. The old man had been caught between the promise of wealth and the certainty of destruction. He'd loved the land too much to see it torn apart, even for riches beyond imagination. But he'd also understood that the knowledge was too valuable to die with him. The final entries, dated just months before Uncle Bill's death, revealed his solution. He would leave the ranch to Jake, along with enough clues to ensure the secret wouldn't be lost forever. But the choice of what to do with that knowledge would belong to the next generation. January 8, 2023, the last entry read, Jake's a good man, spent his whole life working other people's land, never asking for more than honest wages and a place to lay his head. If anyone deserves a chance at something better, it's him. But I won't burden him with this choice. Let him find it on his own, when he's ready. Maybe by then he'll be wise enough to know what to do with it. Jake closed the journal and sat in silence, watching dust motes dance in the afternoon light. Uncle Bill hadn't just left him a ranch, he'd left him a test. The gold was there, waiting beneath the ground like a sleeping giant. But what kind of man would Jake become in the face of such temptation? Would he follow his uncle's example and protect the land, or would he let greed override wisdom? He spent the evening walking the property with new eyes, trying to see it as Uncle Bill had seen it. Not just as 20 acres of struggling ranch land, but as a place where fortunes lay hidden beneath every hill and hollow. The journal had included rough maps, sketches showing where Uncle Bill had found the richest samples. The veins seemed to run in a rough line from the creek bed to the base of the hills, following some ancient geological formation that had concentrated the gold over millions of years. Jake found himself at the root cellar as the sun was setting, the wooden cover still carefully concealed beneath scattered dirt and fallen leaves. He knelt beside it, running his hands over the ground, feeling the weight of Uncle Bill's secret settling into his bones. The old man had carried this knowledge alone for decades, never sharing the burden with another soul. Now that burden was Jake's to bear. That night, Jake spread Uncle Bill's maps on the kitchen table beside the bag of rocks he'd collected. The correlation was obvious once he knew what to look for. The stones from the cellar had all been gathered from the areas Uncle Bill had marked as the richest deposits. The old man had been building a collection, a treasure trove of samples that proved beyond doubt what lay beneath the surface. Jake selected the 3 best pieces from his collection rocks, where the yellow veining was most prominent, where the metal seemed to glow with its own inner light. Uncle Bill's journal had mentioned assayers in Denver, professionals who could test mineral samples and provide certificates of authenticity. It would mean a trip to the city, a risk that someone might remember his visit, but Jake needed to know for certain what he was dealing with. The decision felt momentous, like stepping across a threshold from one life into another. Once he had the assay results, once he knew the true value of what Uncle Bill had left him, there would be no going back to the simple dream of making a living from 20 acres of ranch land. He would have to choose between the quiet life he'd been building and the enormous possibilities that lay hidden beneath his feet. Jake packed the rock samples carefully in his truck, wrapping them in old towels to prevent damage. Uncle Bill's journal went into his jacket pocket, its weight both comforting and troubling. The drive to Denver would take most of a day, but it was a journey he had to make. Whatever he learned, there would determine the course of his future, and possibly the fate of the land Uncle Bill had entrusted to his care. As he prepared for bed, Jake found himself looking once more at Uncle Bill's hat hanging beside the door. The old man had worn it through decades of keeping secrets, of wrestling with choices that had no easy answers. Now it was Jake's turn to carry that burden, to prove himself worthy of the trust that had been placed in him. The rocks in his truck seemed to whisper promises and warnings in equal measure. Tomorrow would bring answers, but tonight Jake lay awake, listening to the wind and wondering if he was ready for whatever truths the morning might reveal. The drive to Denver stretched across 4 hours of high desert and mountain passes, giving Jake plenty of time to rehearse what he would say to the assayer. He'd settled on a simple story. He was a rancher who'd found some interesting rocks on his property and wanted to know if they were worth anything. Not entirely a lie, but not the whole truth either. Uncle Bill's journal had taught him the value of discretion. Rocky Mountain Geological Services occupied a modest building in an industrial district on the outskirts of Denver. Jake had chosen them from a list he'd found online, partly for their location away from the downtown business district, but mostly because their website emphasized confidentiality and quick turnaround times. The kind of place that asked few questions and provided professional answers. Dr. Patricia Webb was younger than Jake had expected, perhaps 45, with steel-gray hair and the steady hands of someone who'd spent years examining tiny fragments under powerful microscopes. Her office walls were lined with geological charts and samples from around the world, testament to a career built on precision and expertise. "Interesting specimens," she said, unwrapping Jake's samples with the careful attention of someone who understood that appearances could be deceiving. "Where did you say you found these?" "On my ranch," Jake replied, sticking to his prepared script. "Up in Millbrook County. Thought they might be worth having tested." Dr. Webb held one of the pieces up to the light, turning it slowly to examine the yellow veining from different angles. The host rock appears to be metamorphosed granite, probably Precambrian. "But these veins—" She paused, reaching for a magnifying glass. "How much of this material do you have?" "Some," Jake said carefully. "Enough to make it worth my while if it's anything valuable. I'll need to run a full analysis, but my preliminary assessment is quite promising. The color, the density, the way it's distributed through the host rockle, the indicators are positive. Can you give me 24 hours? Jake nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral while his heart hammered against his ribs. "That would be fine. How much do I owe you?" $200 for the full analysis, including purity testing and a written report. You can pay when you pick up the results." Jake shook hands with Dr. Webb and walked back to his truck, feeling as if the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Her reaction had been everything he'd hoped for, and everything he'd feared. The samples were promising enough to warrant serious testing, which meant Uncle Bill's decades of secrecy were about to be validated in the most concrete way possible. He spent the night in a cheap motel on the edge of Denver, lying awake and staring at the ceiling while traffic hummed past on the interstate. The samples were being tested just a few miles away, revealing secrets that Uncle Bill had carried to his grave. By tomorrow afternoon, Jake would know whether he was sitting on a fortune or chasing an expensive delusion. The hours crawled by. Jake tried to distract himself with television, with a paperback novel he'd brought along, with plans for improving the ranch regardless of what the tests revealed. Nothing worked. His mind kept returning to Uncle Bill's journal, to the years of careful exploration and agonizing indecision that had preceded this moment. Dr. Webb was waiting for him when he arrived at the lab the next afternoon, a manila envelope in her hands and an expression on her face that Jake couldn't quite read. "Your samples were quite educational," she said, leading him into her office. "I've been doing this for 23 years, and I can honestly say I don't see material like this very often." She opened the envelope and spread several sheets of paper across her desk. The top sheet was covered with technical diagrams and chemical formulas that meant nothing to Jake, but the bottom line was written in plain English that made his breath catch in his throat. Gold content, 94.7% pure. Silver content, 3.1%. Trace elements, 2.2%. 94%, Jake repeated, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "These are exceptional samples," Dr. Webb confirmed. "The purity level is remarkable for raw ore. Typically, you'd expect to see gold content in the 20 to 40% range, even in good deposits. What you've brought me is nearly pure native gold in a quartz matrix. It's the kind of material that mining companies dream about." Jake felt the room spinning slightly around him. Uncle Bill's journal had mentioned 98% purity, but Jake had assumed the old man's testing methods had been less sophisticated. To have those numbers confirmed by modern equipment, by a professional with decades of experience, made everything suddenly and terrifyingly real. "What would material like this be worth?" he asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. Dr. Webb consulted a chart on her computer screen. Based on current gold prices, raw ore of this quality would be worth approximately $1,400 per ounce. But these samples, she held up one of Jake's rocks, weighing it in her palm. This piece alone probably contains 3 to 4 ounces of recoverable gold. You're looking at $4,000 to $5,000 for a rock the size of a softball. Jake's hands began to tremble. He clasped them together in his lap, hoping Dr. Webb wouldn't notice. And if someone had, say, a significant amount of this material, that would depend on how much is significant, Dr. Webb replied. But if you've found a vein of material like this, even a small one, you could be looking at millions of dollars in recoverable gold. Possibly tens of millions, depending on the size and extent of the deposit. The drive back to the ranch passed in a blur of mountain scenery and racing thoughts. Jake kept the assay report in his jacket pocket, the papers crackling against his chest every time he moved. Uncle Bill's conservative estimates had been wrong. The gold was even more valuable than the old man had dared to believe. By the time Jake reached the ranch, the sun was setting behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of gold that seemed like a cosmic joke. He sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the modest cabin and struggling barn, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he now knew lay beneath the ground. According to Uncle Bill's maps, the richest part of the vein ran directly under the area where Jake had been planning to expand the vegetable garden. Every shovelful of dirt he'd turned, every fence post he'd planted, had been driving into ground that was worth more than most people made in a lifetime. Jake pulled the assay report from his pocket and read it again in the fading light. The numbers hadn't changed. 94.7% pure gold, worth $1,400 an ounce, scattered throughout his property in quantities that Uncle Bill had estimated in the tons rather than pounds. The weight of this knowledge settled over him like a physical thing. He was, at least on paper, a very wealthy man. Wealthy enough to quit worrying about water bills and truck repairs, wealthy enough to hire crews to fix everything that was broken and build everything he'd dreamed of, wealthy enough to transform the ranch into something magnificent. But he was also wealthy enough to attract attention he didn't want, from people who wouldn't hesitate to take what he'd found if they thought they could get away with it. Uncle Bill had understood this danger, had spent decades weighing the promise of wealth against the certainty of complications that money always brought. Jake folded the report and slipped it back into his pocket. Tomorrow he would have to decide what to do with this knowledge, but tonight he wanted to sit on his porch and look at his land, the way he had before numbers and possibilities had changed everything. Tonight he wanted to remember what it felt like to be a man whose biggest worry was whether the truck would start in the morning and whether he'd saved enough firewood for winter. Uncle Bill's hat hung on its nail beside the door, and Jake touched the brim gently as he passed. The old man had carried this secret for decades, and now Jake understood why. Some knowledge was too heavy for one person to bear alone, too dangerous to share, too valuable to ignore. Uncle Bill had found a way to live with that paradox, and somehow Jake would have to find his own way forward. Jake tried to keep the secret, but secrets have a way of revealing themselves through the smallest changes in a man's behavior. He'd always been careful with money, but now he found himself buying things he'd previously considered luxuries: better coffee, a new set of work gloves, a decent bottle of whiskey for the long winter evenings ahead. Nothing extravagant, nothing that would raise eyebrows, but enough to make him feel like he was living a lie every time he drove into town. The first sign that his secret was slipping came from Molly Peterson at the hardware store. Jake had been buying supplies for a new chicken coop, calculating lumber costs in his head with the casual confidence of a man who no longer worried about his bank balance. When Molly mentioned that the total came to $347, Jake had simply nodded and pulled out his credit card, without the usual mental gymnastics about whether he could afford it. "Must have been a good cattle season," Molly had commented, processing the payment with the kind of small-town attention to detail that missed nothing. "Something like that," Jake had replied, but he could see the curiosity in her eyes. Everyone in Millbrook knew that Jake Holler was struggling to make ends meet on that cursed ranch. A man who could drop $300 on lumber without flinching was a man whose circumstances had changed. 2 weeks later, Jake made a more serious mistake. He'd been researching mining claims at the county courthouse, trying to understand the legal complexities that Uncle Bill's journal had only hinted at. The clerks in the recorder's office were helpful but thorough, and Jake found himself having to explain his sudden interest in mineral rights and extraction permits. "Planning to do some prospecting?" asked Martha Cleary, the head clerk who'd been recording property transactions in Millbrook County for nearly 30 years. "Just curious about what's involved," Jake had said, but Martha's expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. She'd made copies of the documents he'd requested, but Jake could feel her watching him as he studied maps and survey records that dated back to the territorial days. The real crisis came 3 weeks after his visit to Denver, when Jake discovered he wasn't the only one interested in the Granger ranch's history. He'd driven into town for supplies and stopped at the post office to check his mail. Sarah Martinez was there, picking up a package for the school, and she greeted him with her usual warm smile. "You've been busy lately," she said, sorting through a stack of letters. "Mrs. Henderson mentioned you were at the courthouse, asking about mining claims." Jake felt his stomach drop. Mrs. Henderson was Martha Cleary's sister and the biggest gossip in 3 counties. If she was talking about his courthouse visit, half the town probably knew about it by now. "Just trying to understand what Uncle Bill left me," Jake said, which was true as far as it went. Sarah nodded, but there was something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not suspicion, exactly, but a heightened awareness that made Jake uncomfortable. "Your uncle was a careful man," she said. "Always seemed to know more than he let on." That evening, Jake sat on his porch with Uncle Bill's journal, reading through the entries again and trying to understand how the old man had managed to keep his secret for so long. The answer, it seemed, was patience and isolation. Uncle Bill had rarely gone to town, had kept his research trips to distant cities, had cultivated a reputation as a harmless eccentric who preferred his own company to social obligations. Jake, on the other hand, was beginning to understand that he lacked his uncle's talent for secrecy. He was too honest by nature, too accustomed to the straightforward life of a working cowboy. The weight of hidden knowledge sat poorly on his shoulders, making him nervous and distracted in ways that other people noticed. The realization that he needed help came gradually, through a series of small incidents that demonstrated how unprepared he was for the complexities of his situation. A phone call from a surveyor's office asking about boundary markers, a visit from a county assessor who seemed unusually interested in the ranch's improvements, a casual question from Hank Morrison about whether Jake had found anything interesting while digging around the property. Each interaction felt like a test Jake wasn't sure he was passing. He found himself lying more often than he'd ever lied in his life, and the deception wore on him like an ill-fitting coat. Uncle Bill had been able to live with secrets because he'd understood their necessity, but Jake was beginning to realize that knowledge without wisdom was a dangerous combination. The solution came to him while he was researching property records in the old territorial archives. The Granger ranch had a complicated history, passed through several hands before Uncle Bill had acquired it in the 1970s. But what caught Jake's attention wasn't the chain of ownership, it was the pattern of failed enterprises that had marked the property for over a century. According to the records, the original homesteader had abandoned his claim after 3 years. A cattle company had tried to use it as grazing land in the 1920s, but had given up after losing most of their herd to disease. The Peterson family had attempted dry farming in the 1940s, only to see their crops fail 3 years running. Every attempt to make the land profitable had ended in failure, creating the reputation for bad luck that persisted to this day. But Jake was beginning to suspect that the land's reputation wasn't based on bad luck at all. Reading between the lines of old newspaper accounts and county records, he saw a pattern that suggested previous owners had found traces of gold, but had lacked the resources or knowledge to develop them properly. The curse of the Granger ranch might actually be the result of people discovering wealth they couldn't legally claim or safely extract. The territorial surveys were particularly revealing. In 1891, a government geologist had noted promising mineral traces in the area, but had recommended against further exploration due to hostile conditions and difficult access. The hostile conditions had probably been resolved decades ago, but the difficult access remained a factor that had kept large-scale mining operations away from the area. Jake spent hours poring over maps and documents, trying to piece together the full extent of what lay beneath his property. The original land grant covered not just the 20 acres he'd inherited, but additional sections that had been sold off or abandoned over the years. If the mineral vein extended beyond his current boundaries, the legal complexities could be staggering. More troubling was the discovery that mineral rights and surface rights weren't always the same thing. In some cases, previous owners had sold the mining rights while retaining the surface property, or vice versa. Jake would need a lawyer to sort through the maze of claims and counterclaims that had accumulated over more than a century of failed enterprises. The weight of these complications settled over Jake like a gathering storm. What had seemed like a simple matter of deciding whether to dig up his backyard was revealing itself as a legal and financial challenge that could take years to resolve. Uncle Bill had understood this complexity, had spent decades researching and planning, but he died before putting any of his knowledge to practical use. As Jake drove home from the courthouse, he found himself looking at his property with new eyes. Every hill and hollow potentially held millions of dollars in gold, but every ounce of that wealth was tangled in legal complications that stretched back to the territorial days. He was rich, at least in theory, but he was also trapped by the very knowledge that promised to set him free. The sun was setting as he pulled into his driveway, painting the scrub brush and broken fences in shades of gold that no longer seemed ironic. Uncle Bill's hat hung on its nail beside the door, and Jake touched it gently as he passed, wondering if the old man was laughing at him from whatever distant place the dead called home. Tonight, Jake would read through Uncle Bill's journal again, searching for clues about how to navigate the maze of legal and practical challenges that lay ahead. Tomorrow, he would have to decide whether to seek professional help or continue trying to solve these problems alone. Either choice carried risks that could destroy everything he'd worked for, but doing nothing was no longer an option. The secret was already beginning to leak out, and Jake could feel the weight of attention settling on his small ranch like dust after a windstorm. Soon, people would start asking questions he couldn't answer, and when that happened, his quiet life would be over forever. Sarah Martinez became Jake's anchor in the growing storm of uncertainty that surrounded his secret. Unlike the curious stares and probing questions he encountered elsewhere in town, Sarah's presence offered something rare acceptance without judgment. She'd begun stopping by the ranch on Sunday afternoons, bringing books for Jake to borrow, and staying for coffee that stretched into conversations about everything except the one thing that occupied most of his waking thoughts. Jake kept a photograph of Sarah on his kitchen table, a candid shot he'd taken during one of her visits while she was reading to herself on the front porch. In the picture, she looked completely at peace, her dark hair catching the afternoon light, her expression serene in a way that made Jake's chest tighten with something he hadn't felt in years. The photograph reminded him of what mattered beyond the gold hidden beneath his faith-human connection. Simple pleasures, the possibility of building something lasting with someone who saw value in the man rather than his circumstances. "You've been different lately," Sarah said during one of her visits, settling into the chair across from him with a cup of coffee balanced carefully in her hands. "Not bad, different, just preoccupied, like you're carrying something heavy." Jake felt the familiar weight of his secret pressing against his ribs, demanding to be shared. Sarah was the one person in Millbrook who'd treated him with genuine kindness from the beginning, who'd seen potential in his efforts to resurrect the ranch when everyone else had written him off as another dreamer destined for failure. If anyone deserved to know the truth, it was her. "Sometimes a man finds himself in situations he never expected," Jake said carefully, testing the waters. "Things that change how he sees everything else." Sarah nodded, studying his face with the patient attention she usually reserved for her students. "Good changes or bad changes? That's what I'm trying to figure out." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun track across the valley. Jake found himself memorizing the moment, the way the light fell across Sarah's features, the sound of her breathing, the simple pleasure of sharing space with someone who didn't expect anything from him except honest conversation. "Your uncle used to sit right there," Sarah said eventually, gesturing toward Jake's chair. "I'd stop by sometimes when I was hiking the trails behind your property. He always had coffee ready, like he knew company was coming." "Did he ever talk about the ranch?" about what he hoped to do with it. He said it was waiting for the right person to understand it. Said the land had patience, but it wouldn't wait forever. Sarah paused, her gaze drifting toward the hills that surrounded the property. He talked about you sometimes. Said you had good hands and a steady heart, that you'd know what to do when the time came. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. Uncle Bill had been preparing Sarah too, in his own subtle way, creating connections that would matter when the time came for difficult decisions. The old man had understood that Jake would need allies, people who could be trusted with secrets that would change everything. But trust was a luxury Jake wasn't sure he could afford. Every day brought new reminders of how quickly word traveled in a small town, how innocent conversations could reveal more than intended. Just that morning, he'd overheard two ranchers at the feed store discussing his recent purchases, speculating about where he'd found the money for improvements to his property. The speculation was friendly enough, but it demonstrated how closely his neighbors were watching his activities. The pressure was affecting his sleep, his appetite, his ability to concentrate on the daily tasks that kept the ranch functioning. Jake found himself walking the property lines at night, studying the terrain with Uncle Bill's maps in his pocket, trying to understand the full extent of what lay beneath the surface. The gold vein seemed to run in a rough diagonal across the property, following some ancient geological formation that had concentrated the ore over millions of years. According to Uncle Bill's notes, the richest deposits lay in the area behind the cabin, where Jake had found the root cellar. But the vein extended in both directions, potentially beyond the current property boundaries and into land owned by neighboring ranches. The legal implications were staggering. If the gold extended onto other properties, Jake's claim might be limited to whatever he could extract from his own 20 acres. But if he owned the primary deposit, he might have legal standing to pursue the vein wherever it led. The complexity of these questions drove Jake to seek professional advice, despite the risks involved. He'd found a lawyer in Denver who specialized in mining claims and mineral rights, a man named David Chen, who'd agreed to a consultation on the condition that Jake sign confidentiality agreements that would protect both of them from unwanted attention. The good news, Chen had told him during their first meeting, is that your uncle appears to have done his homework. The mineral rights to your property are clearly established and haven't been separated from the surface rights. You own whatever's down there, at least within your current boundaries. And the bad news? The bad news is that extracting significant quantities of gold from a small property like yours will require permits, environmental studies, and probably the kind of equipment that costs millions of dollars. Unless you're planning to work the claim by hand, you're looking at partnerships with mining companies or investors who may not have your best interests at heart. Jake had left that meeting with more questions than answers, but also with a clearer understanding of the challenges ahead. The gold was legally his, but turning ore into money would require navigating a maze of regulations and business relationships that could easily spiral beyond his control. Meanwhile, the changes in his behavior were becoming harder to hide. Jake found himself studying people's faces for signs of suspicion or greed, wondering who could be trusted and who might try to take advantage if they learned about his discovery. The paranoia was exhausting, a constant weight that colored every interaction and made him question the motives behind even the most innocent conversations. Sarah seemed to sense his growing isolation without understanding its cause. Her visits became more frequent, her conversations more pointed in their attempts to draw him out of whatever darkness was claiming him. She brought him books about local history, recipes for preserving vegetables, stories about her students that made him laugh despite his preoccupations. "You know," she said during one particularly tense afternoon, "sometimes the best way to handle a heavy load is to share it with someone else. Doesn't make the load lighter necessarily, but it makes the carrying easier." Jake looked at her photograph later that evening, trying to imagine what would happen if he told her the truth. Would she see him differently? Would the knowledge change the easy friendship they'd built, turning her into another person who looked at him and saw dollar signs instead of the man who'd been working to build something honest and lasting? The weight of his secret was becoming unbearable, but the consequences of revealing it seemed even worse. Jake was trapped between silence and honesty, between the promise of wealth and the certainty that such wealth would transform everything he'd come to value about his new life. Uncle Bill had carried this burden for decades, but Jake was beginning to understand that he lacked his uncle's patience for solitude. The gold beneath his feet was both blessing and curse, offering freedom while threatening to destroy the very things that made freedom worthwhile. As winter approached and the days grew shorter, Jake found himself spending more time on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the western hills and wondering how much longer he could maintain the pretense of being just another struggling rancher trying to make a go of it on difficult land. The truth was pressing against the walls of his silence like water against a dam, and Jake could feel the cracks beginning to show. The knock on Jake's door came at 7 in the morning on a Tuesday that started like any other. He'd been sitting at his kitchen table with coffee and Uncle Bill's journal, planning his day around fence repairs and the last of the autumn vegetable harvest. When he opened the door, he found 2 men in expensive suits standing on his porch, their polished shoes already dusty from the walk from their black SUV. "Mr. Holler?" The taller man extended a business card with the practiced smoothness of someone accustomed to making first impressions count. "I'm Richard Blackwood from Consolidated Mining Corporation. This is my associate, Tom Bradley. We'd like to discuss a business proposition that might interest you." Jake's blood turned to ice water in his veins. He'd never heard of Consolidated Mining Corporation, but their presence on his doorstep could only mean one thing: his secret was out. Someone had been watching, listening, connecting dots that Jake had thought were too scattered to form a pattern. "I'm not sure what kind of business we'd have to discuss," Jake said, fighting to keep his voice steady while his mind raced through possibilities. Who had talked? How much did they know? How long had they been watching? Blackwood smiled with the confidence of a man holding all the cards. "May we come in? I think you'll find our proposal quite generous, especially considering the unique geological characteristics of your property." The phrase geological characteristics hit Jake like a slap. These men knew about the gold. Somehow, despite all his precautions and Uncle Bill's decades of secrecy, word had gotten out to exactly the kind of people his uncle had spent his life avoiding. Jake stepped aside to let them enter, his mind calculating odds and options, while his guests settled themselves at his kitchen table with the presumptuous ease of men accustomed to getting what they wanted. Blackwood pulled a leather portfolio from his briefcase, while Bradley produced a tablet computer and began taking notes. "We'll cut right to the chase," Blackwood said, spreading documents across Jake's table with theatrical precision. "Our geological surveys have identified your property as containing significant mineral deposits. We're prepared to offer you $15 million for a 99-year mining lease, plus a percentage of gross receipts from any extraction operations." $15 million. The number hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to fully comprehend. Jake stared at the contract documents, their legal language swimming before his eyes, while his brain struggled to process what was happening. "Geological surveys?" Jake managed to ask. "When did you survey my property?" Bradley looked up from his tablet with mild surprise. "Our preliminary assessments are based on satellite data and regional geological analysis. Standard procedure when we're evaluating potential development sites. Nothing that required access to your land, of course." But Jake could see the lie in Bradley's eyes, the subtle tells that came from years of reading men across poker tables and cattle deals. These people had specific knowledge about his property, knowledge that could only have come from inside information. Someone had been feeding them details about his discovery, his research trips, his visits to lawyers and assayers. "That's quite generous," Jake said, playing for time while he tried to understand the full scope of what he was facing. "But I'm not sure I'm interested in mining operations on my land." Blackwood's smile tightened slightly, revealing the steel beneath his polished exterior. "Mr. Holler, I don't think you fully understand the situation. Mineral extraction is a complex business, requiring significant capital investment and technical expertise. Our offer represents a guaranteed return with no risk to yourself. Alternative approaches can be considerably more challenging. The implicit threat was unmistakable. Jake had watched enough corporate battles play out in ranching communities to recognize the tactics, the combination of generous offers and subtle intimidation that encouraged cooperation while discouraging resistance. But what troubled him most was the timing. How had Consolidated Mining learned about his discovery so quickly? Who had betrayed his confidence? "I'll need time to consider your offer," Jake said, gathering the scattered documents into a neat pile. "Something this significant requires careful thought." "Of course," Blackwood replied, though his tone suggested impatience with Jake's hesitation. "But I should mention that our offer has a limited window. Market conditions change rapidly in our industry, and opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely." After the men left, Jake sat at his kitchen table, staring at their business cards and trying to piece together how his carefully guarded secret had been exposed. The answer came to him gradually, through a process of elimination that left him feeling sick to his stomach. He'd been careful about his research trips, his conversations with professionals, his legal consultations. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd trusted the wrong person with too much information. The county courthouse visits, the questions about mineral rights, the research into property boundaries. Someone in the local government system had been watching, listening, and reporting his activities to interested parties. Jake drove into town that afternoon with a growing sense of urgency and betrayal. His first stop was the courthouse, where he found Martha Cleary sorting through property records with the same methodical attention she'd shown for 3 decades. "Jake," she said, looking up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Back for more research? Actually, I wanted to ask you about something. Have you had any other inquiries about the Granger ranch lately? Anyone else interested in the property records?" Martha's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tiny tightening around her eyes that confirmed Jake's worst suspicions. "Can't say that I recall anything specific. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. You know how it is in a small town, people talk." But Jake could see the guilt in Martha's face, the uncomfortable awareness of someone who'd been caught in a compromising position. She'd been the leak, probably contacted by mining company representatives who'd paid her for information about local property research. The betrayal stung more than Jake had expected, not because he'd trusted Martha particularly, but because it demonstrated how naive he'd been about the forces his discovery would set in motion. His next stop was Sarah's house, a modest frame structure near the elementary school where she taught. He found her grading papers at her kitchen table, her dark hair pulled back in the practical bun she wore during school hours. The photograph he kept on his own table didn't capture the way her face lit up when she saw him, the genuine pleasure that made his chest tight with emotions he couldn't afford to examine too closely. "This is a nice surprise," she said, clearing space among the scattered homework assignments. "Coffee? Actually, I need to ask you something important," Jake said, settling into the chair across from her. "Have you talked to anyone about my visits to the courthouse, about the research I've been doing?" Sarah's expression grew serious. "What kind of anyone?" "Mining company representatives, corporate types, asking questions about local property owners." "Jake, what's going on? You're scaring me." The concern in her voice was genuine, but Jake found himself studying her face for signs of deception, for the subtle tells that would indicate she'd been compromised like Martha Cleary. The paranoia disgusted him, even as he recognized its necessity. Trust had become a luxury he couldn't afford, not when millions of dollars and his entire future were at stake. "Some people came to see me this morning," Jake said carefully. "They knew things about my property that they shouldn't have known. Someone's been talking." Sarah leaned forward, her teacher's instincts engaged by the puzzle Jake was presenting. "What kind of things?" Jake made a decision that would change everything between them. He pulled the mining company contract from his jacket pocket and spread it across the table, watching Sarah's eyes widen as she read the financial terms. $15 million, she whispered. "Jake, what did you find out there?" "Something Uncle Bill spent 30 years keeping secret. Something that's going to change everything, whether I want it to or not." Sarah looked up from the contract with an expression Jake couldn't read. "The courthouse research, the trips to Denver, you found gold." It wasn't a question, and Jake realized that Sarah had been putting pieces together for weeks, watching his behavior change and drawing her own conclusions. The relief of finally sharing his burden was overwhelmed by fear of how this knowledge would alter their relationship. "More gold than I ever imagined existed," Jake confirmed. "Enough to make me very rich or very dead, depending on how I handle it." Sarah reached across the table and took his hand, her fingers warm against his palm. "Then we'd better figure out how to keep you alive." The word "we" hung between them like a bridge across dangerous water. Jake felt something shift in his chest, a realignment of possibilities that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with the woman sitting across from him. For the first time since opening Uncle Bill's journal, he began to believe that he might not have to face the future alone. But even as hope flickered to life, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Consolidated Mining Corporation's visit was just the beginning. The men in expensive suits had been too confident, too well-informed, too certain that Jake would eventually accept their terms. They knew something he didn't, possessed some advantage that made them willing to wait for his resistance to crumble. The game had changed, and Jake was no longer sure he understood the rules. But he had Sarah now, and that made all the difference in the world. The letter arrived 3 days after Consolidated Mining's visit, delivered by certified mail that required Jake's signature and left him holding an envelope that felt heavier than its contents should warrant. Inside, he found a single sheet of cream-colored paper bearing Uncle Bill's careful handwriting and a date from just 2 months before the old man's death. "Jake," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you've found what I spent 30 years protecting. And you've also discovered that secrets this valuable don't stay hidden forever. By now, they'll have come calling, smooth-talking men in expensive suits who promise you riches while planning to steal everything that matters. Don't trust them. Don't trust anyone until you've read what I'm about to tell you." Jake's hands trembled as he continued reading. Uncle Bill had anticipated everything: the discovery of the gold, the corporate interest, even Jake's growing isolation as the weight of hidden knowledge became unbearable. But what came next made Jake's blood run cold. "The land holds more than gold, nephew. It holds the key to something that Consolidated Mining has been hunting for 50 years. They're not just after your ore there, after the entire geological formation that runs beneath half the county. Your 20 acres sit at the heart of what may be the largest undiscovered gold deposit in North America. That's why they'll never stop coming. That's why you need to be smarter than they are." The letter went on to detail Uncle Bill's decades of research, not just into the gold beneath the ranch, but into the corporate machinations that had been circling the area like vultures for half a century. Consolidated Mining had a history of acquiring small properties through a combination of generous offers and ruthless pressure tactics, assembling them into larger holdings that could support industrial-scale operations. "They tried to buy me out in 1987, Uncle Bill had written. "Offered me $2 million for land I'd paid $12,000 for 15 years earlier. When I said no, strange things started happening. Cattle poisoned, equipment sabotaged, water well contaminated. They wanted me to think the land was cursed, that I'd be better off taking their money and moving somewhere safer. Instead, I learned to fight back." Jake found himself reading faster, his pulse quickening, as Uncle Bill's final letter revealed the depth of planning that had gone into protecting both the land and the man who would inherit it. The old man had spent years documenting Consolidated Mining's tactics, building legal defenses, and creating a network of allies who could be trusted when the inevitable confrontation came. "There's a safety deposit box at First National Bank in Denver," the letter continued. "Box 347. The key is taped under the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside you'll find copies of everything: geological surveys, legal documents, photographs of what they did to my cattle, recordings of threats they made when they thought no one was listening. You'll also find contact information for people who can help you. Use them." Jake dropped the letter and ran to Uncle Bill's old desk, his fingers fumbling with the brass handles of the bottom drawer. The key was exactly where the letter said it would be, wrapped in electrical tape and stuck to the wood with the kind of care that spoke of a man who understood the value of preparation. The drive to Denver felt like the longest 4 hours of Jake's life. He'd called Sarah before leaving, sharing Uncle Bill's letter and asking her to keep watch over the ranch while he was gone. She'd insisted on coming with him, but Jake had convinced her to stay behind, to be his eyes and ears in Millbrook while he gathered the weapons Uncle Bill had left for this fight. First National Bank was a granite fortress in downtown Denver, its vaults protected by security systems that had been upgraded regularly since the building's construction in 1923. Box 347 sat in a section reserved for long-term rentals, surrounded by other boxes that probably held the secrets of wealthy families and cautious businessmen. Uncle Bill's legacy filled 2 large manila envelopes and a wooden box that Jake recognized as a humidor from the old man's smoking days. Inside the first envelope, Jake found geological surveys that made his amateur collection look like a child's rock gathering. Professional maps showed the full extent of the gold formation, stretching across nearly 4,000 acres of ranchland in a rough crescent that encompassed half a dozen properties. The second envelope contained documentation of Consolidated Mining's 50-year campaign to acquire the area. Contracts, correspondence, legal filings that painted a picture of systematic harassment and intimidation. Uncle Bill had been meticulous in his record-keeping, photographing damaged equipment, collecting samples of poisoned water, even recording phone conversations that captured corporate representatives making threats that would be illegal in any court of law. But it was the contents of the humidor that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. Uncle Bill had saved the best for last geological reports from the 1970s that showed the true scope of what lay beneath the surface. According to projections based on core samples and seismic surveys, the gold deposit was worth not millions but billions of dollars. Enough money to transform the entire region, to turn a collection of struggling ranches into one of the richest mining operations in the world. Jake understood now why Consolidated Mining had been patient for so long, why they'd been willing to wait decades for the right opportunity to move forward. They weren't just after his little ranch, they were after the geological jackpot that would make the company's executives rich beyond imagination and turn the Millbrook Valley into an industrial wasteland. The final document in the humidor was a contact list, handwritten in Uncle Bill's careful script. Names and phone numbers of lawyers, environmental activists, investigative journalists, and federal officials who specialized in mining law and corporate fraud. Uncle Bill had built a network of allies who could be activated when the time came to fight back against forces that had seemed insurmountable. Jake spent the rest of the day making phone calls from his motel room, explaining his situation to people who'd been waiting years for Uncle Bill to give them the signal to move forward. The response was immediate and coordinating. Within hours, Jake found himself at the center of a growing coalition of legal and environmental experts who understood exactly what Consolidated Mining was planning and how to stop them. Rebecca Morrison, an environmental lawyer who'd been fighting mining companies for 20 years, agreed to meet Jake for dinner at a restaurant near his motel. She was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair, and the kind of intense focus that came from years of David and Goliath battles against corporate giants. "Your uncle was a remarkable man," she told Jake over coffee and dessert. He spent decades building the case against Consolidated Mining, documenting their illegal activities, gathering evidence that could shut down their operations permanently. But he needed someone on the inside, someone who actually owned part of the land they wanted. "And now they have that someone," Jake said. "Now we have that someone," Rebecca corrected. "The evidence your uncle collected is damning, but it needs to be presented by someone with legal standing to challenge their operations. You're the key to everything, Jake. Without your cooperation, all of Uncle Bill's work was just preparation." Jake learned that evening about class action lawsuits and environmental impact studies, about federal mining regulations and the rights of small property owners against corporate encroachment. Rebecca and her colleagues had been preparing for this fight for years, building legal strategies and gathering expert witnesses who could testify to the environmental and economic damage that large-scale mining would bring to the region. But legal battles took time, and Consolidated Mining wasn't known for their patience when significant money was at stake. Rebecca warned Jake that the company would escalate their pressure tactics, that the generous offer would soon be replaced by threats and intimidation designed to force his compliance. "They're probably watching your ranch right now," she said, "photographing your activities, monitoring your communications, looking for leverage they can use against you. You need to be very careful about who you trust and what information you share." Jake drove back to Millbrook the next morning with Uncle Bill's evidence secured in a bank safety deposit box of his own and Rebecca's phone number programmed into a new cell phone that couldn't be traced back to his regular activities. The coalition was mobilizing, lawyers were filing preliminary injunctions, and environmental groups were preparing to make Consolidated Mining's aggressive tactics a matter of public record. But Jake also drove home with the knowledge that his quiet life on the ranch was over forever. Whether he won or lost the coming battle, he would never again be just another struggling rancher trying to make a living from difficult land. He was now the center of a conflict that would determine the fate of thousands of acres and billions of dollars, a David facing a Goliath that had been preparing for this fight for 50 years. Sarah was waiting for him when he pulled into his driveway, sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee and an expression that told him she had news he wouldn't want to hear. Uncle Bill's hat still hung on its nail beside the door, but now it seemed less like a memorial and more like a battle standard, a reminder of the war that Uncle Bill had begun and Jake would have to finish. "They've been here," Sarah said before Jake could ask. "3 different times since you left. Not just looking around, measuring things, taking photographs, acting like they owned the place." Jake felt the familiar weight of anger and fear settling in his chest. The battle lines were drawn, the opening moves had been made, and there was no longer any possibility of avoiding the confrontation that Uncle Bill had spent 30 years preparing for. Tomorrow, Jake would have to decide whether to fight or surrender, whether to honor his uncle's legacy or accept defeat at the hands of people who saw the land only as a source of profit. But tonight, he sat on his porch with Sarah beside him, watching the sun set behind hills that held secrets worth billions of dollars, and tried to remember what it felt like to be a man whose biggest worry was whether he'd saved enough firewood for winter. Those days were gone forever, but the memory of them would sustain him through whatever battles lay ahead. The confrontation came at dawn on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Jake's return from Denver. He'd been expecting it, had spent sleepless nights, watching the horizon for signs of the corporate army that Uncle Bill's documents had taught him to anticipate. When the convoy of black SUVs finally appeared on the dirt road leading to his ranch, Jake was ready for them. He stood on his front porch with Uncle Bill's hat in his hands, the original land survey document spread across a small table beside him, and his phone recording everything that was about to unfold. Sarah sat in her car at the end of the driveway, positioned to serve as both witness and escape route if things went wrong. Rebecca Morrison was on speed dial, ready to mobilize legal injunctions and media attention at a moment's notice. Richard Blackwood emerged from the lead vehicle with a confidence that hadn't dimmed since their first meeting, but this time he was accompanied by 6 other men who made no effort to hide their intimidating presence. Corporate muscle dressed in business suits, the kind of people who solved problems through methods that never appeared in quarterly reports. "Mr. Holler," Blackwood called out as he approached the porch, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider our generous offer." Jake held up the original territorial survey that Uncle Bill had preserved in his safety deposit box, the document that established mineral rights to the property dating back to 1887. "Actually, I've been doing some research of my own. Interesting reading these old land grants, especially the parts about mineral rights and federal protection for historic claims." Blackwood's expression tightened slightly, the first crack in his polished facade. "I'm not sure what you think you've discovered, but I can assure you that our legal team has thoroughly reviewed all relevant documentation. Your property is subject to eminent domain provisions under the National Mining Act of 1872. "Funny thing about that act," Jake replied, unfolding a second document with deliberate care. "It contains specific protections for small-scale family operations and historic claims. According to this analysis by the Department of Interior, prepared at the request of Senator Williams' officini, attempt to seize family-owned mining claims through eminent domain would require extensive environmental review and community impact studies." The mention of Senator Williams was Jake's first deliberate shot across Consolidated Mining's bow. Uncle Bill's network had included political connections at the federal level, people who'd been waiting years for the opportunity to challenge the mining industry's more aggressive tactics. Rebecca Morrison had spent the previous week mobilizing those connections, ensuring that Jake's fight would have support in Washington. Blackwood stepped closer to the porch, his voice dropping to a more conversational tone that somehow seemed more threatening than his previous bluster. "Mr. Holler, I think you may be misunderstanding the situation. Consolidated Mining has invested significant resources in this region, and we have commitments to our shareholders that must be honored. Your cooperation would make this process much smoother for everyone involved, including the people whose cattle you poisoned in 1987. Jake asked, producing a folder of photographs from Uncle Bill's evidence collection. "Or the families you forced off their land through water contamination and equipment sabotage." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Blackwood's companions exchanged glances that spoke of careful legal coaching about what could and couldn't be discussed in potentially recorded conversations. The mining company had spent decades covering their tracks, but Uncle Bill had been equally methodical in documenting their crimes. "I don't know what you think those photos prove," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Historical allegations that were never substantiated." "Actually, they were substantiated," Jake interrupted, pulling out a thick folder of legal documents. "Federal investigators confirmed water contamination at 3 different properties. State officials documented livestock poisoning that matched the chemical signature of mining operations. The only reason charges were never filed was because the affected landowners accepted settlements that included non-disclosure agreements." Jake was drawing on weeks of preparation, conversations with Rebecca Morrison and her team that had revealed the full scope of Consolidated Mining's legal vulnerabilities. The company had been careful to avoid criminal charges, but their civil liability was enormous if the right evidence was presented in the right forum. "This conversation is pointless," Blackwood declared, signaling to his companions with a gesture that sent them spreading out across Jake's yard. "Our geologists need to conduct soil tests to verify our preliminary assessments. You can cooperate voluntarily, or we can obtain the necessary legal authority to proceed without your consent." But Jake was ready for this move too. He pulled out his phone and speed-dialed Rebecca Morrison's number, putting the call on speaker so everyone could hear her voice cutting through the morning air. "Rebecca Morrison, Environmental Law Associates. This call is being recorded for legal documentation. Mr. Holler, are there currently Consolidated Mining representatives on your property without your permission?" "Yes," Jake said clearly. 6 men who are threatening to conduct unauthorized soil tests despite my explicit refusal to grant access." "Gentlemen," Rebecca's voice continued, "you are now officially notified that any unauthorized activity on Mr. Holler's property will be considered criminal trespass and will result in immediate federal prosecution. Furthermore, any samples taken without proper environmental permits will be inadmissible in any legal proceeding and will constitute theft of private property." The men stopped moving, their confident advance faltering in the face of legal language that carried the weight of federal enforcement. Blackwood's face had gone pale beneath his corporate tan, and Jake could see him calculating the costs of pushing forward against the benefits of strategic retreat. "This isn't over," Blackwood said, finally, gathering his team with sharp gestures. "Mr. Holler, you're making a very expensive mistake. Our offer won't remain available indefinitely." "I'm counting on that," Jake replied, watching the convoy of SUVs retreat down his driveway like defeated soldiers, leaving a battlefield they'd expected to win. The real battle began 3 days later, not with corporate intimidation, but with something far more dangerous: community pressure, orchestrated by people Jake had considered neighbors and friends. Word had spread through Millbrook about the confrontation at his ranch, but the story that emerged bore little resemblance to what had actually happened. According to the version circulating through town, Jake had been secretly negotiating with outside mining interests while hiding his discovery from the local community that had supported him. The narrative painted him as a greedy opportunist who'd been planning to sell out his neighbors for personal profit, bringing industrial destruction to a valley that had remained unspoiled for generations. Jake discovered the depth of the problem when he stopped at the hardware store for fence repairs and found Molly Peterson's usual friendly greeting replaced by cold professionalism. Other customers who'd previously offered casual conversation now avoided eye contact, their body language radiating disapproval and disappointment. "Folks are talking, Jake," Molly said as she rang up his purchases, her voice carrying the weight of community judgment. "They're saying you've been planning to turn this whole valley into a strip mine. That true?" "It's not that simple," Jake began. But Molly's expression suggested she'd already made up her mind about his motivations and trustworthiness. The situation crystallized that evening when Jake attended what had been advertised as a routine town meeting, but turned out to be something closer to a trial. The Millbrook Community Center was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the parking lot. The air crackled with tension and barely contained anger from citizens who felt betrayed by someone they'd watched struggle to build a life among them. Hank Morrison served as unofficial prosecutor, standing at the front of the room with a confidence that came from having the crowd firmly on his side. "Jake Holler came to this town claiming he wanted to ranch that cursed land," Morrison declared, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "Turns out he was just another outside speculator looking to make a quick profit at our expense." The accusations came fast and furious after that. People stood to share stories of industrial disasters they'd witnessed in other communities, of mining companies that had promised economic development but delivered only environmental destruction, and abandoned towns. The fear was real and justified, based on decades of experience with corporate exploitation of rural communities. But Jake could see Consolidated Mining's hand in the orchestrated nature of the opposition. The talking points were too polished, the legal arguments too sophisticated for a spontaneous community uprising. Blackwood's team had been busy in the 3 days since their confrontation, turning Jake's neighbors against him through a combination of selective information and carefully cultivated fear. When Jake was finally given a chance to speak, the hostile crowd made it clear they weren't interested in explanations or nuanced discussions of complex issues. They wanted simple answers to complicated questions, and they wanted assurance that their quiet valley wouldn't be transformed into an industrial wasteland. "I understand your concerns," Jake began, standing at the front of the room with every eye focused on his face. "You're worried about protecting something precious, and you should be. This land deserves protection from people who see it only as a source of profit." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "But I'm not the enemy here. For 50 years, Consolidated Mining has been trying to acquire enough land in this valley to support industrial-scale mining operations. They've used intimidation, environmental sabotage, and legal manipulation to force families off their property. My uncle spent 30 years fighting them, and now they're trying to use you to finish what they couldn't accomplish through direct confrontation." Jake produced a folder containing some of Uncle Bill's documentation, spreading photographs and legal documents across the table where everyone could see them. These pictures show what happened to the Williamson Ranch in 1987 when they refused to sell to Consolidated Mining. Cattle poisoned, water wells contaminated, equipment destroyed. The company offered to help with the cleanup, but only if the Williamsons agreed to sell their land at below market prices. The crowd's hostility began to shift as people examined the evidence, seeing their own community's history from a perspective that corporate representatives had never shared. Faces that had been hard with anger began to show confusion and concern as the scope of Consolidated Mining's campaign became clear. Sarah stood from her seat in the middle of the room, her teacher's voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. The question isn't whether Jake found gold on his property. The question is whether we're going to let outside corporations manipulate us into fighting each other instead of protecting what we all value. Her intervention shifted the entire dynamic of the meeting. People began asking different questions, focusing on how to protect the community rather than how to punish Jake for his discovery. The conversation evolved from accusations and demands to strategic planning and alliance building. By the end of the evening, Jake found himself at the center of a growing coalition of local property owners who understood that their individual survival depended on collective resistance to corporate pressure. The community charter that emerged from that meeting wasn't just a document, it was a declaration of independence from outside forces that had been manipulating their lives for decades. Hank Morrison shook Jake's hand as the meeting ended, his earlier hostility replaced by grudging respect. "You could have taken their money and run," Morrison said. "Lot of people would have." "This is my home now," Jake replied. "You don't sell out your home." The battle wasn't over, but the terms had fundamentally changed. Jake was no longer fighting alone against corporate giant. She was leading a community that had finally understood the true nature of the threat they faced together. 5 years later, Jake stood on his front porch, watching the sunrise paint the Millbrook Valley in shades of gold that no longer seemed ironic. The new ranch sign beside his driveway read, "Holler Heritage Ranchest, 2024. But the real transformation lay in what couldn't be seen from the road, the careful balance between preservation and prosperity that had become his life's work. The gold was still there, sleeping beneath 20 acres of carefully tended land. Jake had never denied its existence, but he'd chosen a different relationship with the wealth that Uncle Bill had entrusted to his care. Instead of industrial extraction, he'd developed a small-scale operation that honored both the land and the community that had rallied to protect it. Working with Rebecca Morrison and a team of environmental engineers, Jake had designed a mining operation that resembled traditional prospecting more than modern industrial extraction. Small crews with hand tools and careful techniques extracted modest quantities of ore from selected sites, always with an eye toward restoration and minimal environmental impact. The operation employed 12 local workers and generated enough income to support not just Jake's needs, but a community fund that helped other small ranchers improve their properties and resist outside pressure. The income was substantial but not overwhelming, perhaps $2 million annually after expenses and environmental restoration costs. Enough to transform Jake's life without destroying the values that had guided his choices. He'd kept the original cabin, but added modern amenities that made daily life more comfortable. The barn had been rebuilt with materials that honored its original character while incorporating efficiency improvements that Uncle Bill would have appreciated. Sarah's presence had been the greatest transformation of all. She'd moved to the ranch 2 years earlier after a wedding ceremony held in the same community center where Jake had once faced an angry crowd. Their partnership extended beyond marriage into shared stewardship of the land and the principles that guided its use. Sarah had left her teaching position to help manage the ranch's educational programs, which brought school groups and visitors to learn about sustainable resource management and the history of the region. The vegetable garden had expanded into a demonstration project that supplied fresh produce to 3 neighboring counties. Jake had discovered that the same geological processes that had concentrated gold in the soil had also created exceptional growing conditions for certain crops. The garden produced enough income to be self-sustaining, while serving as proof that the land could support multiple forms of prosperity. Uncle Bill's hat still hung on its nail beside the front door, but now It was accompanied by photographs that documented the ranch's evolution, pictures of community meetings, environmental restoration projects, and the faces of people who'd found employment and purpose through Jake's careful development of his inheritance. The hat had become less a memorial than a reminder of the wisdom that came from patience and long-term thinking. The broader impact of Jake's choices had extended far beyond his own property. The community charter that had emerged from that contentious town meeting had evolved into a regional alliance of small property owners who'd successfully resisted 3 separate attempts by mining companies to establish industrial bezerool operations in the valley. The alliance had become a model for other rural communities facing similar pressures, demonstrating that collective action could preserve both economic opportunity and environmental integrity. Consolidated Mining had eventually abandoned their campaign for the Millbrook Valley, finding easier targets in regions where communities lacked the cohesion and legal resources that Uncle Bill's network had provided. Richard Blackwood had been quietly reassigned to overseas operations after the company's board decided that the public relations costs of fighting Jake's coalition outweighed the potential profits from the gold deposits. Jake's relationship with the town had been transformed as well. The skepticism and mockery that had greeted his inheritance had been replaced by something deeper: respect earned through consistent choices that put community welfare ahead of personal profit. He was no longer the outsider trying to prove himself worthy of acceptance, but a leader whose judgment people trusted when difficult decisions needed to be made. The ranch itself had become a symbol of what was possible when traditional values met modern challenges. Visitors came from across the country to study Jake's mining operation, his sustainable agriculture programs, and the community partnership model that had protected the valley from industrial exploitation. The ranch hosted conferences on rural development, environmental restoration, and the kind of patient stewardship that created lasting value rather than quick profits. On quiet evenings, Jake and Sarah would sit on the front porch and talk about the future they were building together. The gold would last for generations if managed carefully, providing steady income for community development and environmental protection. But the real wealth lay in what they'd learned about the relationship between individual prosperity and collective welfare, between economic opportunity and environmental responsibility. Jake had kept Uncle Bill's journal, adding his own entries that documented the ranch's evolution and the lessons learned through 5 years of careful experimentation. The journal had become a record of choices made and consequences accepted, a testament to the possibility of finding middle ground between exploitation and preservation. "You know what Uncle Bill would say about all this?" Sarah asked one evening, gesturing toward the restored barn and the garden that stretched toward the hills. "That the land chose well," Jake replied, remembering his uncle's final letter and the trust it had placed in decisions yet to be made. The ranch had taught Jake that true wealth wasn't measured in the gold beneath his feet, but in the relationships he'd built and the legacy he was creating for future generations. He'd inherited 20 acres of scrub and the burden of enormous responsibility, but he'd created something that honored both the land and the community that sustained it. As the sun set behind the western hills, Jake touched Uncle Bill's hat gently and went inside to help Sarah prepare dinner for the neighbors who'd become family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight he was exactly where he belonged, home, on land that had chosen him as surely as he'd chosen it, surrounded by people who understood that some things were worth more than money, and that the greatest fortunes were those shared with others. The gold was still there, patient and enduring, waiting for whatever wisdom the future would bring, and Jake Holler was exactly the kind of man to provide it.